Hello.
So this is Na'eem Jeenah, and we are very honored to have you in our show today. Na'eem Jeenah is the Executive Director of the Johannesburg-based think tank, the Afro-Middle East Centre. He's the author of a number of books, and his latest book, which is coming out soon, is called Political Islam, Between Islamic States and Muslim Social Movements. Do I have it right?
Yes, correct.
Yes, okay. So, Na'eem, first of all, could you tell me what an ethnocratic state is? I was a bit curious, when I read that. I know that's one of your books. It's
Yes.
the part of the title of one of your books. Could you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, so the book is called Pretending Democracy, Israel and Ethnocratic State. So Israel, of course, likes to pretend that it's a democratic state. And in some ways it is. Very much like South Africa under apartheid was a very good democratic state. If you were white, of course. And in the case of Israel, if you're Jewish. So the nature of the state is very much based on people's ethnicity. As in the South African case, it was based on people's race. And so it's an ethnocratic state where everything about how the state works and is structured is based on the notion of ethnicity.
So what is interesting to me in this is that it somehow, to me, brings up the images also of a theocratic state, in the sense that often religion is defined through race or, a place of origin or a particular tribe. So is there an overlap between theocracy and...
Not really, and I think that this is the difference.
Okay.
That while Israel pretends that it's all about the Jewish people and the Jewish religion, and so God promised them the land and that's why they're there, the reality is that most of the leaders of the Zionist movement are not even religious, and many of them atheists, so they don't believe in the God that promised them the land. So it's all really based on ethnicity. So they define Jewishness in an ethnic sense rather than a religious sense. While in a theocratic state it would be based on a particular religion and religious ideas and ideals.
So which brings me to another question about migrant laborers being turned away from Israel, African migrant laborers. So you think that race is a big factor in this, because some of them are Jews. I mean, there are black Jews in the world, as we know.
No, so race very much is a factor.
Okay.
In this case. So in the Israeli context, there's a privileging of Jews, firstly, but secondly, there's a privileging of Ashkenazi Jews, European Jews, over Mizrahi and Sephardim Jews, let's say Oriental Jews as they sometimes called, over Ethiopian Jews, and then others. So that third level of Ethiopian Jews, they're really on the border. And now with the attempts to get rid of African migrants, most of whom of course are refugee seekers, asylum seekers, the Ethiopian Jews have fallen into that same pot. And they're black, so they need to go. So it's very much a racial thing mixed up with the ethnicity.
I see. Now, Na'eem, recently we heard that the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, announced that they're going to cut, or the government is actually thinking of cutting all diplomatic ties with Israel. But from what I understand, the South African government has always been quite vocal against the Israeli occupation. So how is this different from before?
Well, so a few things around this. I mean, firstly, that apartheid South Africa had very close relations with Israel. And those relations were not just diplomatic and trade, but they were very close cooperation in terms of intelligence, military, arms development, and even the nuclear program. So South Africa and Israel jointly developed their nuclear weapons programs, which South Africa subsequently, of course, destroyed in the early 1990s, the nuclear weapons. But so all of this there was very close relationship. When, after our democratic elections in 1994, the government didn't end the relationship or didn't even put any kind of obstacles to that relationship. So the relationship continued. Even though the ANC took a very strong position that was pro-Palestinian, at least in rhetoric, was very close to the PLO. ANC and PLO, I mean, even fighters even trained together and fought together in some instances. So there was that historical relationship. Yasser Arafat used to visit South Africa once or twice a year to consult with Nelson Mandela before he was killed. So there was a very close relationship. But that didn't affect, or the ANC in government didn't allow that to affect the state relations with Israel.
So that is a very interesting point, because from the reports that one reads, as a as somebody who's not from South Africa, what you get is a very strong worded opposition to Israeli rule, of Israel. Right. But you are saying that they actually didn't do anything formally.
Well, they're very vocal against Israeli human rights violations, and although not so much in the past few years, but before that, I mean, from Mandela's era into Thabo Mbeki's presidency, virtually every second week there was a statement that was put out by the Foreign Affairs Department criticizing this or that human rights violation by Israel. And the Israelis would complain, and the Americans would complain, and but South Africans would say no that. So in terms of how they vocalized the opposition, they were fairly strong, okay? But in reality, in terms of the relationship, there wasn't a break. Not only not a break, but not even a weakening. And then in 2003, because by 2003, South Africa, then Thabo Mbeki as president, attempted to insert South Africa into playing some kind of mediating role between Israelis and Palestinians. Which of course the Israelis really don't care for, because if they have the only superpower in the world on their side, why do they care about a country like South Africa? So they kind of played along, but what then happened was that South African intention became the stick by which the Israelis and the Zionist lobby in South Africa beat South Africa with. So every time South Africa would say something critical about Israel, the statement from the Israelis and the local pro-Israeli lobby would be, this is unhelpful to South Africa's role as a mediator. Okay, so then in order to attempt to kind of balance South Africa's role, because it was clear that South Africa had a stronger pro-Palestinian bias, at least verbally. In order to balance that, in 2003, South Africa and Israel signed a trade agreement. And from then until now, trade has generally been increasing quite substantially in both directions. So from a trade perspective, the relationship between the two states is very good. Diplomatic relations still exist, but over the past few years there have been some problems. So the South African government decided about 4 or 5 years ago, for example, that no government officials and the ANC, no ANC officials would be allowed to visit Israel unless it was in the context of talking peace or something like that, right? Or playing some kind of that kind of role. So there was that kind of thing. But below the radar, a number of things happened. So even a number of government departments, for example, security equipment that they use comes from Israel. Our telecommunications provider, Telkom, which is majority government owned, their billing systems are Israeli. So our billing record sits in Israel on databases there. So all of these things still continue, right?
And again,
now in terms of weapons sales,
yes.
So military weaponry,
yes.
That ended in 1998.
Okay.
And ANC's response to criticism around that was that there were existing contracts that had to be fulfilled, and so they fulfilled those until 1998, when those contracts ended. Recently, I think there was one incident about 2 years ago where South Africa bought an Israeli product, but not from Israel. That's the excuse, through somewhere else. But that's strictly military weaponry. Things like surveillance equipment, household security stuff, a lot of that comes from Israel. Now, in the context of Cyril Ramaphosa's statements recently, so what happened at the ANC's national conference in December was that there was a resolution taken and was unanimously adopted that the ANC as the ruling party or as a party calls on the South African government to downgrade the diplomatic relationship with Israel and to downgrade our embassy in Tel Aviv to that of a liaison office.
And was that at the same time as when the US declared that the embassy should be moved to Jerusalem?
It was around the same time, but it was just after that.
So
but it wasn't affected by that.
Okay.
So the ANC's policy conference, which prepares recommendations for the national conference, sat in June and adopted this as a recommendation.
But somehow the timing was such as if, this was in response to what the US did.
It was coincidental.
No. Okay.
The campaigning around it within the ANC started before June, before the policy conference. Okay. Then June, the recommendation, and then more campaigning until December when it was adopted as a resolution. Okay. But, there are many ANC resolutions on all kinds of things, which sit as ANC resolutions and don't necessarily get implemented by government. So the question is this going to be one of those? Where it's a nice resolution, the ANC has taken a position as a party, but government doesn't follow through. So that's the question. We wait to see what will happen. Over the past 2 months, we've heard Cyril Ramaphosa himself, just before he became president of the country and just after as well, mentioning the resolution and saying that this was a relation. So that seems to give an indication that he's taking it seriously. And then in the responses to his State of the Nation address, the main ANC respondent, Naledi Pandor, who is also a minister, then again reminded people about this resolution of the ANC. So again, there's a sense that maybe they are taking it more seriously than leaving it as an ANC resolution, but we will see. And of course, there's already a huge amount of lobbying against it from the pro-Israeli lobby. And I would suspect the Americans as well.
Yes. So Na'eem, when it comes to diplomatic relations or the cutting off of diplomatic relations on the international arena, we have noticed that Israel does not really care. Like you were saying also, if the most powerful country is on their side, they wouldn't really care. So how important are these kind of gestures, if I may call them, by any government really, be it South African or any other government?
No, I don't think it's correct. I think that Israel does care.
Okay.
And they put South Africa in a particular camp that they believe are antagonists. Okay. But they do care in general, and there's a very big Israeli push over the past couple of years now on the African continent. Okay. South Africa is an important player on the African continent. And if South Africa takes such a move, then there's a possibility that others might get influenced. Although right now I think that the Israeli influence is very strong in certain countries, West Africa, East Africa for example. But there's always that danger, and then South Africa also is something of a player, although that has reduced substantially over the past decade, but something of a player on the global level. Certainly in terms of the global south, apart from BRICS, the other structures, etc. So Israel does care. The pro-Israeli lobby in South Africa spent literally millions of rands in the run-up to the December conference to lobby against it. And that was in terms of people, politicians, people within other constitutional structures in the country that they lobbied, the private sector. There was a whole kind of fear campaign that was started from saying that South African jobs will be lost as a result, to saying that Christians will not be able to visit holy sites anymore, and everything in between. So there's a huge campaign, and that's because they do care.
But the public opinion in South Africa, do you think it is strongly against or in favor
of the resolution?
Of Israeli, politics.
I mean, I would say that in terms of black people, people who are not white. In terms of black people in South Africa, the vast majority are pro-Palestinian.
Okay.
So among whites, I think that probably a majority is pro-Israeli.
I see. And I also read some reports where a couple of people said something like it's hard to be Jewish in South Africa as a response to whatever was happening. And have you ever come across that kind of stuff?
Yes, every now and then, and particularly from Israelis.
Okay.
Not so much from South African Jews.
Okay.
Because the reality is that South African Jews actually have it very good, like all South Africans. Let's say, I don't like the term, but let's say all South African minorities. We have a very strong constitution. We have a government and a state that takes the constitution most of the time quite seriously, right? Except when they're stealing money from the state, but that's another matter. And issues around the protection of people's rights are taken very seriously, right? So Jews in South Africa are probably safer than most other countries in the world, certainly safer than in Israel, and perhaps second only to the United States, frankly. And that's why Jews in South Africa are majority, not all of course, but majority are Zionist. The South African Jewish community sends the second largest amount of money of any country to Israel, the largest per capita. Okay. The Jews in South Africa are very influential. Their voice is louder than their numbers might suggest. In terms of their articulation, in terms of their economic involvement, their political involvement, and all kinds of things. So there's, Jews are very safe in South Africa. They're as safe in South Africa as Muslims are or Hindus are.
Okay. So Na'eem, now to conclude, I have two questions. So we'll have to sort of, put them in about 8 minutes. The first question is with regards to BDS, and how, coming from a moral standpoint, South Africa having had this struggle against apartheid, how can South Africa be influential in that movement, So one question is that. And the last question that is very important for us, because we work on peace and communal dialogue, is how do you see other communities in South Africa, coming together and actually fighting this another form of apartheid in another part of the world?
Yeah. So, on the first question, for South Africans, the whole notion, certainly for South African activists who've been anti-apartheid activists in the past, the whole idea of BDS is not a foreign one. And we employed the similar kind of strategy or tactics within our broader strategy in the South African struggle. We didn't call it BDS, but we called it the sanctions campaign, which included boycotts and disinvestment, as we call it, etc. So it's not an unfamiliar kind of way to go, and in fact the BDS movement fashioned the BDS campaign on the South African experience. Having said that, in reality, South Africa's contribution to BDS is more symbolic than real, than concrete. Why? Because we're not that big a trading partner with Israel. Okay. This has been our argument also against the pro-Israeli lobby in terms of the downgrading. And they said, if there's downgrading, then Israeli companies will close down, which of course the resolution doesn't say they should, but even if they did, the investment in South Africa is not that great. We could do without it. The trade between the two countries we could do without, right? And Israel could as well do without us. So in real concrete terms, South Africa's role in the BDS movement economically is not that strong. But it is strong symbolically, it is strong politically, and it's strong morally. Because we can say that, this is where we come from, we understand what apartheid means, we know how we fought against apartheid, and that's what we're talking about, right? And then the last question was? The last question was,
just like various communities, irrespective of their faith affiliations, came together to fight apartheid. Do you think there's a possibility of a movement here, which may be able to voice itself internationally against the apartheid that we are seeing in Palestine?
I think there already is a Palestinian solidarity movement here that fulfills that. You know, it's solidarity, and there's a number of different organizations.
But I guess more in terms of different religions coming together, because...
No, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's one or two organizations, for example, that are majority Muslim, and if you had to look at the pro-Palestinian kind of activists across the country, probably majority Muslim still, right?
That's what I mean, because recently we did go to an event that impacted a Muslim community in another part of the world, but it was, you know, a very important human rights issues, and we hardly saw anybody else, you know, besides Muslims.
Now the Palestinian one is more and more attracting people who are not Muslim, whether Christians, atheists, number of less leftists who don't identify with any particular religion, that are part of the movement.
Okay.
Trade unionists, other political figures. So
are there any Jewish organizations that you can think of?
Yes, there's two Jewish organizations.
Okay.
Perhaps the most prominent one is South African Jews for Free Palestine.
Okay.
And then some of the other solidarity groups which are kind of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, for example, which has a sprinkling of Muslims, but it is mostly not Muslim, mostly kind of leftist, former activists who are involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. So yeah, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in that regard in terms of broadening out that base. But certainly in terms of the way South Africa can be seen or should be seen in terms of its Palestinian solidarity on the global level, it's not a Muslim solidarity movement.
Okay.
So as much as South Africa kind of has this, let's say, symbolic role and is recognized for its struggle against apartheid and all of that, and therefore has, you know, some kind of moral standing, for better or worse, the struggle of the Palestinian people now takes place in a very different context to that of our struggle. And the different context is one where you have a very belligerent superpower that increasingly is just completely unapologetically supportive in all kinds of ways of the occupying power in this case, and the oppressive power which is Israel. And what we really need is a global, a strong global solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. And I mean, I think one of the most important places, perhaps more than South Africa, is really the United States. I mean, it's the United States that gives Israel billions of dollars of military aid every year. It's the United States that protects Israel in the United Nations and other such fora. It's the United States that protects it in all kinds of other ways. And so it's first and foremost American citizens who need to understand that their tax dollars, which they fighting for in terms of things like healthcare and other social services, etc., that billions of those dollars are going to Israel to support an illegal occupation, to support the building of illegal houses on stolen land, and to support human rights violations and the imprisonment of children, etc. If Americans can sleep at night knowing that that's what they're paying taxes for, then I would be very surprised. But and particularly, I should say, I think one of the crucial elements, certainly within the American population, is American Jews. American Jews that are willing to stand up and say that we're Americans and we're Jewish and we don't support Israel. And there's a growing number of such people, and I think that that's a very important element, because the Israeli state and the Zionist movement claims to do this in the name of Jews.
That is true, and that is why it is so much easier or more common to see signs in the yards or like in front of synagogues saying we support Israel, then we support Palestine or human rights or so on. People are still afraid to put those kind of signs out. So we are still not yet, at that stage. Yeah. But it is building up.
No, it's building up, and I think that there are a number of Jews around the world who now have, are creating a network across the world where they can, as a network, say that Jews across the world, or there are Jews across the world that don't support Israel.
That is true.
And a number of Israeli Jews. I mean, you talk about Ilan Pape in Johannesburg, Ron Greenstein, who is an academic at Wits University,
yes,
very vocal on these issues. Yeah. So a number of Israeli Jews as well who are coming out very strongly, believing that the Israeli state is immoral, its position is immoral. A number of them now saying that the only solution is a one-state solution, even going even beyond what many Palestinians might be saying. So I think that such a global movement, using as a central part of its strategy a non-violent strategy, which is BDS.
So one more question for our audience in India, I would like to ask. Moving from you say North America and then Africa, we are talking about South Africa taking the lead. In Asia, we find that India is considered a big brother, in the South Asian context especially. And after China is often considered the most powerful country economically. And from a moral standpoint, India was always against the Israeli occupation. But in recent years, that has changed a lot, and there's not only trade links, but military links with Israel, which is in a lot of ways many steps backwards. How do you see that, as part of the power play?
Before the BJP,
yes,
my criticism of India would be the same as my criticism of South Africa. They say a lot of the non-aligned movement, etc., for whatever that's worth, but in terms of real policy, it's not quite there. And the battle, the pro-Palestinian battle in both countries, still has a big slog ahead. After the BJP and Modi, I think we're talking about a completely different India, certainly at the state level. We're talking about an India that's very much more racist, very much more ethnicist, very much more right-wing, and economically as well, liberal and becoming neoliberal. And from that kind of an agenda perspective, Israel is an ideal brother. So when Modi visited his first trip to Palestine and just met Netanyahu and didn't visit Ramallah, there's no reason for us to be surprised. As far as Modi is concerned, Mahmoud Abbas is a stranger, while Netanyahu is a guy he can stand on the beach with and chat to, like brothers, right? So I think that India's problem is bigger than it being too close to Israel. I think India's problem is its political elite at the moment, and the BJP, and what that means not just in terms of the Palestinians, but also what that means in terms of Indians.
Yes.
Whether they Dalit Indians or Muslim Indians or Christian Indians or Hindu Indians who are not right-wing fundamentalists.
Yes, because most Hindu Indians would disagree with the kind of philosophy BJP is championing at the moment. Yeah.
So I think that's a whole package. India will become more pro-Palestinian if it becomes less racist.
How lovely. Thank you very much. That was great.